Outer Wilds is a very pure and uncluttered experience that blends story and gameplay in a way that many other games struggle to do well. While it can certainly be appreciated for its impressive implementation of astrophysics, focusing solely on the mechanics would be short-sighted. It's the intangible qualities that make this one special. This game is absolutely worth seeing through to the end. It simply cannot be fully appreciated until experienced in its entirety. That being said, I can also imagine many players bouncing off Outer Wilds rather easily, due to the perfect storm of confusion if you get off on the wrong foot. Between the unwieldy controls, the lack of direction, and the cryptic nature of your circumstances, I wouldn't blame anyone for spending the first 30+ minutes making zero progress and tossing the game aside out of frustration. But if you were one of those players, I would encourage giving the game another chance. It took me 2 serious attempts to start enjoying Outer Wilds, but that persistence paid off dividends, and I'm confident that the same thing could happen for many others. If you do decide to return to the game in light of this intro, I'd like to offer 2 quick pieces of advice before getting into spoiler territory. First off, if the flight controls are giving you trouble, remember that there is no friction in space. It takes time to accelerate and decelerate, so keep that in mind when approaching a specific planet. Locking onto an object will tell you its position and how fast it's moving relative to you, so pay attention to that number and use it to determine when to speed up and slow down. Second, if you're totally lost and can't figure out what to do, following the signal scope sounds would be a decent place to start. They can serve as the beginnings of a thread that lead you to bigger and better discoveries. But above all else, don't worry about doing things wrong and just let your curiosity guide you. You're allowed to work at your own pace. From this point onwards, this video will contain spoilers for Outer Wilds. There will also be spoilers for Echoes of the Eye towards the end. I'll be sure to give another warning before that happens. The adoration around this game is peculiar because most of its audience will tell you about how it's such a transcendent, one-of-a-kind title, but they won't actually tell you why. They aren't wrong to do so, given how even a mild spoiler can dampen the experience, but it does mean that one may get the wrong idea that Outer Wilds is complex, difficult to interpret, or pretentious. It's a pleasant surprise to see that the story is anything but. One of the greatest strengths of Outer Wilds is how its more literary themes manage to invoke such a whirlwind of emotions through relatively simple storytelling. For starters, the game begins without any particularly grand ambitions. You play as a member of an alien species embarking on your first ever mission to space simply because you can. Exploring space is completely normalized in the culture of the Hearthians, so even though it is viewed as a momentous occasion for your character, there are no underlying reasons for your mission. The game states very plainly that you don't even have as much as an objective to pursue once you're up there. In that sense, your journey starts out as being relatively insignificant, which seems counterintuitive for such a story-driven game, but it's through challenging many expectations like this that Outer Wilds succeeds. Nearly every game that I can think of makes some kind of attempt at an attractive hook, ranging from a story-heavy expository cutscene to draw the player in, or by throwing them into an action sequence as soon as the game boots up. The closest Outer Wilds gets to something like this is the first event with the Nomai statue, but even then the overall tone is very subdued. There doesn't appear to be any immediate adverse consequences, and it doesn't exactly set the story in motion. Your character would still be venturing to space whether they had this vision or not. It just happened to occur in the midst of ongoing plans to add an extra layer of mystery, rather than being the inciting incident that gives you purpose. I think Outer Wilds' hook is that the beginning is so unremarkable and casual that it piques your interest in a sort of reverse psychological way. It has enough faith in its premise and in its players to embark on this journey without any extrinsic enticement. There's a nostalgic quality to Outer Wilds that's difficult to fully describe, but this opening is a good place to start. With older games, players and developers had no choice but to use their imagination and be very experimental, because certain limitations didn't always leave room for elaborate tutorials, expository dialogue, or even gentle reminders about what to do next. The onus was almost entirely on the player to let their curiosity guide them, which was, and still is, a big part of the appeal for those games. Jump to the present, and it almost seems like we've gone in the opposite direction. If a game doesn't give players at least a little bit of guidance on what to do, it's often viewed as poor design that's met with frustration rather than inquisition. To be fair, games have only grown more complicated since then, so that kind of response isn't entirely unreasonable, but the point is, Outer Wilds is one of the best rekindlings of that retro wonder that I've seen in recent years. It very easily could have given players more context or guided them to easier planets to start out, but it doesn't. As soon as you step onto the ship, the world is your oyster, and you're given absolute free reign over the experience. There's a mutual understanding between the game and the player that, if you did as much as to purchase and launch the thing, you should be interested enough to sort some things out on your own. That's not to say that the game is completely lacking in a grounded introduction, because it does have one, but it's very clever about easing players in without being condescending. You can play around in the starting village as much as you want, and aside from the Zero-G cave and maybe the model ship, nothing is explicitly stated to be a tutorial, even though most information you can gather here will help you out somewhere in the solar system. For instance, you can learn immediately that ghost matter is detected by cameras, which is vital information for traversing certain sections, but you don't know the importance of that information yet. Several exhibits in the observatory are also scaled-down versions of concepts that you'll later encounter, but again, the player is still in a blissful ignorance stage. You won't realize that you're being taught something until you encounter it firsthand out in the real world. Patronizing tutorials that hold your hand like you've never touched a controller before are one of the biggest hurdles in any game as far as I see it, but Outer Wilds successfully rectified that in its intro and turned them into a strength. Because all of these things are effectively tutorials, they're just masked in a way to arouse interest, instead of breathing down the player's neck with text pop-ups and HUD markers and so on. Once you're cut loose from your humble little beginnings, one of the game's smartest qualities will quickly become apparent. A unique element of Outer Wilds that's a big relief to see is the simplicity and brevity found across its story. While making the actual discoveries can be a complicated endeavor, the mysteries of the Nomai are relatively straightforward in terms of writing and plot. What I mean is, there's no flowery language or hidden meanings beneath the dialogue. The Nomai speak very candidly so that all of their mysteries are straightforward and easy to follow. Whenever you visit a critical location, the logs will explain exactly what happened with just the right amount of detail to keep it interesting without being hard to understand, and it's up to the player to see how that information can enable their progress elsewhere in the world. One way of looking at this would be that this forthright writing style makes for smoother gameplay since every piece of text has to be simple enough to be summarized in just a few sentences on the ship log, but once again, that doesn't capture the full picture. The beauty of Outer Wilds' story doesn't come from being extremely intellectual or thematically complex, but rather how it uses its interweaving plotlines to create a lucid gameplay experience. Great stories don't necessarily have to be complex. In fact, I would argue that when it comes to video games, the way a story is being told is more important than the contents of the story itself. Standard convention has story events relayed to the player through cutscenes or dialogue, moments where your interactivity is either completely stripped away or amounts to pressing the A button every time a character is done saying their lines. While this is the preferred method for probably 90% of games that try to have a story, it's also a very uninspired angle to take. To be clear, these types of stories can be perfectly serviceable, and usually do add at least some value to the games they're present in, but interrupting interactivity so the player can read some text or watch a video does miss out on what makes games unique to begin with. If we hypothetically removed all of the cutscenes from Horizon Zero Dawn, many of the mechanics would still remain intact because of that clear distinction between those facets. It doesn't matter how good the cinematography may be or how well the dialogue is written, they don't do anything for the gameplay. If you ask me, this is something we should be rethinking with games if we want stories to be more involved. It's not a coincidence that some of the most effective stories close that divide and create a marriage between plot and gameplay so that one is necessary to make the other worthwhile. Outer Wilds is one of few games to fall under this umbrella. It focuses on delivering a simple but very powerful message that can only be properly conveyed because it's in an interactive game. A key principle of all of the mysteries is that they have to be solved in a non-linear fashion. There's plenty of media that's done non-linear storytelling before, but books, movies, TV shows, and so on don't have the same unique advantages that a game does, that being the flexibility. A TV show with a non-linear plot still has to be consumed in a linear manner to be properly enjoyed. You can't jump from episode 1 to episode 7 to episode 12, then back to episode 2, and still expect everything to make sense. But if a non-linear game is well executed, there are effectively thousands of different pathways that you can take to reach the end, and all of them can have an equal level of clarity. You can't have that same kind of personal journey elsewhere. This is a big part of what I mean when I say that Outer Wilds is a perfect example of how to blend story and gameplay. It takes the unique capabilities of video games and uses them to deliver a narrative that can only be uncovered thanks to player agency. You may encounter some weird, esoteric event in the first hour that doesn't make a lick of sense at the time, but 10 hours later you'll read a know-my text explaining the rules around how that event works and how it can be manipulated. The puzzle pieces in your head fall into place, and the result is a very coherent intersection of gameplay and story that can only be found in this medium. Every player uncovers their ship log just a little bit differently than everyone else, but no matter what, we're all led to the same revelations by the end. And it's fascinating that something so malleable has the power to create the same memorable experience for so many players. I'm not sure if there's an official word for what I'm about to describe, but an equally wonderful principle that Outer Wilds firmly stands by is its progressionless design. Many games use tangible rewards as a means of motivating players to play to the end, whether that comes in the form of in-game currency, new items, new abilities, level ups, or whatever. Depending on how broadly you define it, all of these things could be considered a part of a progression system. They're concrete ways to measure how far you've gotten in a game. And this manifests in almost every game in existence to varying degrees. It could be something more subtle, like an ability unlock in a platformer, which is completely reasonable, or something very blatant, like leveling up your account to attain a fancier looking name placard in a live service game, which is arguably exploitative. But let's not get too carried away. The closest Outer Wilds gets to having a measurable benchmark for your progress is the nodes you unlock in the ship log, but aside from that, nothing is tracked or unlocked physically. The game could be described as a soft Metroidvania, which is very fitting, just not in the traditional sense. Areas aren't gated by equipment or ability unlocks, they're gated by the player's knowledge. It's very impressive how secrets are hidden in plain sight in light of this. All of these information keys are very eloquent solutions derived from your basic capabilities. You just don't think to look for them until it's pointed out directly to you. For example, one of the earliest mysteries that bothered me was trying to dive beneath the water on Giant's Deep. The key is to enter a cyclone rotating counterclockwise instead of clockwise, which was there the entire time. It just blended in so well with the environment that I never thought to look for it. Same goes for the quantum moon. The imaging rule is such a clean solution that makes sense once you learn about it. It's just a matter of unlocking that part of your brain, in the same way you would unlock a new area by getting a wall jump in a traditional Metroidvania. In theory, all of this sounds a bit counterproductive, since it could make the player feel stupid for not seeing something that was there the entire time, but in practice, it's how the game creates those very satisfying click moments where you can't help but admire the ingenuity. It's quite the risky approach to design because these solutions seem so obvious after you learn about them, and I could imagine some very perceptive players picking up on them without needing any hints, but on the whole the game does a masterful job at obscuring them just enough to not give anything away. And even if you do spot a solution on your own, we've already discussed how the game is flexible enough to allow for that. If we bring this back around to the discussion on progression systems, it's clear that Mobius Digital wanted players to keep playing Outer Wilds because they were personally invested in the journey, not because of external factors egging them on, like getting cool ship upgrades or gathering new items or anything like that. It would be easy to just have an item teleport you to the Quantum Moon after descending the Tower of Quantum Trials, which would effectively be pretty similar, but physical rewards like that don't create the same magic of realization that we have now. The game enables progression in its absolute purest form, and in a time when progression systems have wormed their way into many places where they don't belong, that's incredibly refreshing to see. Aside from serving the more thematic elements, the time loop helps reinforce this idea that nothing is physically unlocked, which is another good example of creating gameplay mechanics out of important story events. The main disadvantage I think the time loop can have relates back to what I said at the very beginning of this video. It's arguably the main ingredient that can confuse players to a point where they aren't interested in the game anymore. If you get unlucky with how you proceed on your first few space flights, in that you don't find anything that contributes to the ship log, the time loop is like the cherry on top that sours the overall experience, because this notion of progressionless design hasn't quite been learned yet. Resetting your progress every 22 minutes is a very frustrating prospect when you haven't even grasped what the game wants you to do yet, something that certainly isn't helped by a total lack of explanation about what's happening to you. Basically, what I'm trying to say is I think Outer Wilds' biggest flaw is that it requires untold persistence or luck before you can start enjoying it, perhaps both. You need to put up with the absolute confusion for 30 to 60 minutes before settling into the gameplay loop, and you need to hope that your initial space flights don't end up taking you to one of the more complicated parts of the map. I remember my very first time playing, I fell into Brittle Hollow's black hole and spent the remainder of the loop aimlessly floating through space thinking I did something I wasn't supposed to, because it was too dark and overwhelming to notice the white hole station just ahead, and I probably wouldn't have been confident enough in my flight abilities at that point anyway to even get there. If you can look past this problem and successfully make it through a few loops, you'll hopefully be captivated by both the mystery of the world and the bursts of excitement for filling in new ship log nodes. I think it's communicated pretty well that escaping the time loop is the overarching goal, but the way the mechanic is presented also has an unexpected impact on the atmosphere that permeates the experience until the very end. The time loop may feel very stressful at first, since 22 minutes doesn't feel very long, but the fact that none of your decisions are permanent takes a lot of the pressure off and almost puts a relaxing spin on exploration. It's questionable whether you can make mistakes in Outer Wilds, but if you can, you aren't faced with any significant consequences, since everything will be reverted once the loop is over. Somewhat paradoxically, the supernova can be a bit of a relief because it creates the safety net of having effectively unlimited chances to do everything. There's no risk of accidentally locking yourself out of optional content or doing things in a supposed wrong order. One might be able to argue that a lack of consequence cheapens the dramatic effect of important moments, but it ultimately serves the idea that Outer Wilds is a game about exploration first and foremost, and allowing for that sort of freedom contributes greatly to that principle. Having some kind of harsher punishment for death would discourage experimentation and encourage caution, which works against the wild curiosity that the game tries to foster in its players otherwise. I'd also like to point out that the developers deserve credit for rectifying a rather noticeable mechanical flaw with the time loop system. Certain planets will change over the course of the 22 minutes, and observing those changes is a part of many mysteries, which creates the issue of needing to wait for enough time to pass before you can experiment with certain solutions. This manifested for me personally during the final challenge with the Ash Twin project. You need the sand to sink enough so that you can access one of the towers, which takes about 5 to 8 minutes from the start of the loop, and even after that it could take some time before you work out how to use the teleporter properly. If you had to wait that long every loop just to try a potential solution, there would be a lot of wasted time, which is one of the worst things a game can do in my opinion, but fortunately Outer Wilds offers two helpful solutions that don't feel out of place. The first is simply resting at a campfire, which will pass time faster. You can sleep until the on-screen timer indicates that enough time has passed that something has opened up. It is subtle, and I missed out on it for a while, but it does have a handful of helpful use cases. The second is through implementing a menu option to reset the loop after you talk to Gabbro. This one might come off as a little too gamey for some players, but I think it was done in a sensible way that avoids being too immersion breaking, for lack of a better word. All in all, the time loop is a very clever feature, and it's hard to imagine the game working without it in place. It serves every other component very well, from the story to the literary themes to the exploration to the progression, and as the capstone mystery that's at the very center of your journey, it is a deeply satisfying enigma to uncover. Ending the time loop and subsequently realizing what that actually entails is almost inarguably the climax of the experience, which brings us to what I think is the most important thing about Outer Wilds. The way it keeps players engaged isn't through mastering mechanics or taxing their critical thinking skills, because compared to more traditional mystery games, it's relatively light on the logic and deduction side of things. Instead, it's purely through the emotional payoff that the journey provides throughout its runtime, and it's in this visceral way that I think the game succeeds the most. Before going further, I would like to give that second spoiler warning. The remainder of this video is focused on the story and themes of Outer Wilds, which will include parts of Echoes of the Eye. If you haven't played the DLC, I urge you not to spoil it for yourself. It has some of the most intense moments in the entire game that are best experienced firsthand. If you ask me, the most memorable stories are the ones that can elicit strong feeling. Story composition, sentence structure, and logical plot developments are all certainly crucial, but if a story can connect with the audience in a more intimate way, these technical details tend to fall by the wayside, and we can instead focus on the actual message the piece is trying to convey. Outer Wilds provides those heavy emotional moments in spades, which is ultimately what makes it a more profound experience among its mystery game peers. This isn't just an oscillation between periods of high-tense plot twists and low-energy exposition. Instead, it's a mixed concoction of different emotions. The general tone of the game fills the player with a great sense of wonder, but certain tragedies that the Nomai went through are very depressing. Stepping onto the quantum moon and meeting an unfamiliar life form is incredibly cryptic, while the entirety of Echoes of the Eye is all about instilling fear and isolation. There are about a dozen different ways I felt across the game's runtime, and I would like to take some time to explore how exactly Outer Wilds successfully hits all of these thoroughly different yet powerful emotional beats. Earlier in this video, I talked about how the dialogue being written in a very blunt and straightforward manner was beneficial for the game's style of storytelling, but an equally impressive aspect of that is how full of personality the Nomai are despite this simpler writing style. Now, I don't really mean that on an individual level, because with how many different characters you'll read about, I'd be surprised if the majority of players could keep all of them and their associated mysteries straight in their head. Instead, all of the Nomai sort of blend together to create this culture of innocence and curiosity, and the player is drawn in by that sort of mindset rather than each character themselves. Their collective excitement for the Eye of the Universe or the Quantum Moon is very endearing, and one of the strongest reasons I had to keep playing was to see if or how the Nomai achieved their goals. Their attitude towards space exploration reflects that of the Hearthians as well. Even though neither race crossed paths, you both have a shared passion for the universe, and that goes a long way in helping the player form stronger bonds with this group. All of this is to say that the writers excelled at making the player feel empathetic towards the Nomai, enough so that their successes and failures start to rub off on you. It's very easy to root for them given how altruistic they were, enough to the point where seeing them happy makes you happy. Learning about their breakthroughs is exciting beyond the new nuggets of information because of how much they exude optimism. And this is largely where the joyous part of Outer Wilds lies, reading about the Nomai's enthusiasm for their work, or hearing them celebrate new developments as they inch closer and closer to finding the Eye. On the contrary, this empathy is just as strong during sad moments as it is during happy ones. One of the most somber parts of the entire game for me was exploring the Hanging City and reading about how the Nomai had to resort to this location after desperately looking for a place to shelter. Their despondent writings, combined with the crumbling of brittle hollow around you, makes it very easy to feel the sort of turmoil that they were going through, and though they're a very capable bunch, they didn't deserve this kind of emotional stress. The Hanging City also shows how compassionate they were to each other, and seeing them worry so much for each other's well-being led to some of the most melancholic lines of dialogue in the entire game. An equally powerful moment is first discovering the Sun Station, another upsetting event that doubles as a brilliant instance of subverted expectations. It's basically guaranteed that, before teleporting here, you'll learn about the Nomai's plans to use the Sun Station to intentionally trigger a supernova, thereby providing a source of power for the Ash Twin project. This is already a pretty jaw-dropping discovery because it's leading up to the pivotal mystery of the game, but also because it's the only incident that aroused some conflict among the Nomai. Idea was very vocal about her opposition to the Sun Station on ethical grounds, while others insisted that it was necessary to help find the Eye of the Universe, and while this dilemma doesn't exactly go anywhere, it does help build tension to make reaching the Sun Station all the more worthwhile. Upon teleporting to the satellite, though, you learn that the project didn't work, and it barely caused a reaction in the Sun at all. This turned out to be such a massive blow to the Nomai's efforts that even the ones who opposed the project were upset, and hearing them lament their failure leaves such a powerful impression that the player is just as disappointed as they are. Not in an unsatisfactory sense, but in a sympathetic sense. You're disappointed for them because their excitement for the project was so infectious. If you're someone who heavily values extrinsic rewards for making progress, I could see this as being a very anticlimactic sequence, but the sorrow that I felt during moments like these was such a strong emotional payoff that made the time investment more than worthwhile. For as amazing as these experiences were, perhaps the strongest emotion that Outer Wilds regularly dabbles in is fear, which is where Echoes of the Eye comes into play. While the base game has some undeniably scary moments, chief among them being the anglerfish on Dark Bramble, fear is so core to the DLC's identity that you could probably fill an entire video about that one topic alone. For our purposes, however, I think it's mainly worth discussing the sheer intensity that Echoes of the Eye offers. Fear is about one of the most subjective things on the planet, but I would be very impressed and envious if there's anybody out there who went through the entire DLC without feeling any semblance of anxiety or tension. It starts out innocently enough. The Stranger is one of the greatest visual marvels that the game offers, but the dream world sits in very stark contrast to that beauty. If you're like me, the DLC is one of the most frightening games you've ever played. The main reason is that Echoes of the Eye focuses more on being a terrifying experience rather than a horrific one. Whereas horror is the shock and disgust of witnessing a frightening event, terror is the looming dread that one feels leading up to that moment. Horror is witnessing a jump scare that makes you scream, and terror is the suspense preceding it that makes you quiver. Echoes of the Eye does both of these things, but it's much heavier on the terror aspects than the horror ones, which I think turned out for the better. The dream world has a brutally oppressive atmosphere where you have to constantly work around threats that you can't see. It's almost always too dark to make out what's directly ahead of you without focusing your artifact, but doing so carries the danger of shining your light right onto an inhabitant and subsequently putting yourself at risk. Capitalizing on a fear of the dark is probably one of the most common tricks found in the horror genre, but it's particularly successful in Echoes of the Eye since it's a constant threat. When you blow the lights out somewhere in the dream world, you've essentially opened the floodgates and can be snatched up at any time if you aren't careful. The darkness may feel more frustrating than frightening at first, but if you approach the DLC with the mindset that atmosphere takes precedence over raw fun, it becomes easier to appreciate that kind of ambience. Personally, the game tapped into my anxieties so much that there were times when I was paralyzed with fear and had to pause the game for a moment just to calm down. My terror was at its peak whenever I knew an inhabitant was lurking somewhere in the vicinity. I hated not being able to see them easily, I hated being chased in the dark, but I still walked away satisfied from the rush of emotions that the experience provided. And that's what I think is the best thing about the DLC. It speaks to the ability of games not needing to be traditionally fun to be worthwhile. Echoes of the Eye might not have been enjoyable in the moment, but the intensity of the entire thing is now seared in my memory, and that's not something that's easily found elsewhere. It absolutely deserves credit for being able to elicit such a strong reaction, regardless of whether those feelings are positive or negative. Incidentally, if we take a look at the horror aspects of the DLC, some of its flaws will start becoming apparent. If you can manage to get past the terror aspects of wandering in the dark and the ambient noises of the dream world, it becomes clear that the stranger's inhabitants are actually quite restricted in what they can do, which breaks the tension in otherwise stressful moments. Stealth sections can regress into tedious bouts of manipulating the inhabitants to walk somewhere that you carefully dictate, and by that point it becomes known that you're just working against an artificial intelligence at the end of the day. This isn't helped by the fact that the inhabitants don't always work well in their environment. They're capable of grabbing you through walls, which, while rare, makes for very frustrating gameplay. The result is an environment that doesn't feel as lived in compared to the planets in the base game. Again, I would like to make it clear that this is only noticeable when in direct encounters with the inhabitants. The suspenseful thriller side of things remains strong, but the rest of the experience suffers from awkward implementation of AI and stealth mechanics. These problems aren't severe enough to keep me from recommending you finish Echoes of the Eye, especially considering that the final sequence of solving the last few puzzles and freeing the prisoner is very well done. I don't think it's as cathartic as the base game ending, but it's certainly more clever. Intentionally dying on the fire to walk through the Dreamworld alarm safely is one of the coolest puzzles in the entire game, and Mobius Digital absolutely deserves praise for their creativity here, especially considering the standard that they set with the base game. Once you look past the stealth sections, the elegance of the puzzles and solutions remains fully intact in the DLC. Additionally, meeting the prisoner and sharing knowledge with each other is quite a heartfelt moment, enough so that it feels like a reward for the stress and tension you had to go through to reach this point. The prisoner is the only inhabitant who didn't fear the Eye, so it makes sense that upon meeting them, any fear that you have will begin to subside. They're much easier to connect with since their perspective is more in line with yours in the Nomai's. Finally, being able to grant them the closure that they longed for is very rewarding. The final slideshow that shows the knowledge you've gathered feels like a very grand send-off that has you reflecting on all the progress you made, and it was very impressive seeing it accurately depict the information you've gathered in your ship log. This slideshow will actually change depending on how much you've discovered in the base game, which sheds further light on just how adaptive Outer Wilds really is. Throughout the entire game, the developers considered basically every possibility from the player, no matter how much it could quote-unquote break the game. They considered that the player might die before the first loop. They considered that the player might create a paradox with the Ash Twins black hole. They even considered that the player might try to stay in the dream world forever after stopping the time loop in the real world. Rather than implementing some hacky restrictions to eliminate these possibilities, they embraced them. It might have been tempting to block access to the stranger until you saw enough of the base game to get the full experience from the slideshow, but the game throws that notion to the wind and accommodates the player instead of the other way around. That kind of attention to detail is commendable on its own. Even so, for as great as the ending of Echoes of the Eye really is, the artistry in the base game ending is so phenomenal that it would be an incredibly tall task to match it with the DLC. In terms of raw emotional power, it doesn't come all that close, but that speaks more to the strength of the original rather than any weaknesses with the expansion. Outer Wilds is one of very few games I can think of where the ending is my favorite part. Gathering everyone's instruments and sharing your final moments together is a wonderfully tender moment that exposes some deeper vulnerabilities in our species. I think the message that you take away from Outer Wilds can speak a lot to your subjective worldview. The more nihilistic among us might feel some validation watching the hatchling go through all this effort of discovering the Eye only for you and your friends to meet their demise shortly thereafter. I have to concede that even I got roped into those hopeless feelings a little bit immediately after finishing the game, because the only thought that sat with me as I stared at the credits roll was that one day, everything that we all know and love is going to die. Given how content the Hearthians felt towards the end, though, I don't think it would be fair to walk away with such a pessimistic outlook. From my perspective, Outer Wilds is very humbling because it forces us to recognize the finite nature of our world. As humans, we seem to have an obsession with living as long as possible, both on an individual level and a collective one. Western culture especially tends to value youth over old age, but even when you reach those very senior years, living beyond 80, 90, or 100 years old is seen as something to be celebrated. In the distant future, when medicine reaches a level well beyond what we have now, maybe the average life expectancy will reach 150 years, or 200 years, or 300 years, or even longer than that. Moreover, colonizing other planets seems to be a very long-term goal for the survival of our species. You and I might not be around to see it, but I think it's fair to say that it'll happen eventually. In the event that long-distance space travel ever becomes commonplace, who knows how long the human race will last? This all sounds like an incredible thing, but at a certain point, I'd have to ask why we want to prolong our existence for so long. Finishing Outer Wilds has left me with a nagging sense that all of these scientific and cultural developments are born out of a fear of our own demise more than anything else, and I do wonder if that's a good enough justification. If the goal is to escape our own death, it doesn't matter how many technological advancements we make. Death is an inevitable process in everything that lives. Assuming that we can outsmart our own natural life cycles gives off an inflated sense of self-importance more than anything else. Most media depicts death in a very negative light because humans, by and large, are afraid of it, so it's no surprise that Outer Wilds stands out for poking holes in that common perception. Despite the subject matter being rather grim on the surface, it turns out as one of the most optimistic stories that has ever been told in a video game thanks to how it helps us come to terms with our own existence. Perhaps the greatest thing that gives life purpose is the fact that it ends, and learning how to let go gives us a greater appreciation for living in the moment. I'm not sure if I subscribe to the idea that prolonging our species until the end of time is a reasonable line of thought. All of us will die someday, and that's fine. If Outer Wilds has the power to ease a person's anxiety like that, I don't think much more needs to be said. It's an undeniably effective story. The puzzles may be clever, and the mysteries may be interesting, but above all else, the end of the world has never been so beautiful. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, the support really does help out. Hope to see you next time.